America did not lose Singapore militarily. It did not lose Singapore diplomatically. It did not lose Singapore in any way that produced a White House address, a State Department briefing, a breaking news chyron, or a single dramatic image that could dominate the evening news. The loss was quieter than that, and because it was quieter, it may prove far more permanent. On the 14th and 15th of March, 2025, while Washington's attention was fixed on tariff headlines, campaign messaging, and the daily management of domestic political noise, Singapore finalized a series of agreements that redirected hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure financing, trade settlement, and technology partnership toward Beijing and away from Washington for the next 2 decades. No missiles, no sanctions announcement from the other side, no troops crossing a border, just signatures, regulatory frameworks, settlement architecture, and strategic capital allocation. In other words, the language in which the 21st century increasingly decides power. That is what makes this episode so important, because most people still imagine strategic defeat in 20th century terms. They imagine it arriving with photographs of burning vehicles, collapsing fronts, emergency summits, and maps filled with arrows. But that is not how real power is often lost in the modern era. It is lost in the fine print. It is lost in settlement systems. It is lost in who clears the transaction, who writes the financing rules, who holds the data, who becomes the indispensable intermediary, and who slowly stops needing you. That is what happened here, and Washington barely noticed. Not because the information was hidden, not because no one could have known, but because decision makers were looking for the wrong signals. They were looking for visible confrontation in a world where strategic displacement increasingly happens through administrative decisions, banking architecture, and commercial realignment. This is what strategic defeat looks like when the battlefield is no longer primarily territorial. It does not announce itself with gunfire. It announces itself with a term sheet. It arrives through a bilateral framework agreement. It appears in a weekend press release issued in a time zone where the American policy class is asleep. And by the time the significance is understood, the underlying system has already begun to move. So the real question is not simply what happened in those 48 hours. The real question is why it happened, why Singapore mattered so much, why the shift was structurally predictable, and what it means not only for American strategy, but for every American whose savings, pension, mortgage rate, retirement account, or job security rests on the continued primacy of the dollar-centered financial order. Because this is not just a story about Singapore, it is a story about the erosion of invisible advantages that Americans have lived on for decades without fully seeing them. To understand why Singapore matters so disproportionately to its physical size, you first have to understand what Singapore actually is. Singapore is not just a small, successful city-state with an efficient government, a world-class port, and a high-income economy. Those things are true, but they are not the point. The point is that Singapore is a node. It is one of the most important transaction processing, dispute mitigating, capital routing, confidence generating nodes in the global financial system. Its physical footprint is tiny. Its systemic footprint is enormous. For much of the post-Cold War era, Singapore has functioned as one of the most reliable anchors of American-aligned financial architecture in Asia. Regional capital moved through it. Trade was intermediated through it. Commodity hedging passed through it. Legal arbitration was structured through it. Cross-border dollar clearing depended on it. Private wealth sought refuge in it. Supply chains were coordinated through it. It became, in effect, one of the cleanest, safest, and most trusted interfaces between Asian growth and the dollar system. That role gave Singapore power, but it also gave the United States something even more valuable: leverage wrapped in normality. When regional firms in Southeast Asia traded across borders, when banks settled obligations, when shipping contracts were hedged, when commodity exposure was managed, when financial institutions needed a stable hub between local markets and global capital, Singapore often stood in the middle. And because Singapore's system was deeply interwoven with dollar clearing and Western regulatory standards, that meant Washington enjoyed not just economic benefits, but informational and strategic ones. This is the hidden architecture of hegemony. Hegemony is not only aircraft carriers and sanctions lists. It is the ability to remain present inside the routine operation of other people's economic lives. It is the ability to see flows, influence terms, set compliance thresholds, define acceptable behavior, and make participation in your system more attractive than any alternative. That was the bargain for decades. Singapore prospered by operating inside American-designed financial gravity. America benefited because one of Asia's most sophisticated hubs effectively reinforced the dollar's regional centrality. But every hegemonic system contains within it a danger that dominant powers rarely recognize early enough: the temptation to treat dependence as permanent. Washington gradually came to assume that access to the dollar system was such a powerful privilege and exclusion from it such a devastating penalty that aligned financial hubs would continue to absorb increasing compliance burdens indefinitely. For a long time, that assumption worked. Then the arithmetic changed. The groundwork for the March 2025 shift was not laid in 48 hours. It was laid over years of cumulative pressure. Repeated secondary sanctions expansions, widening compliance obligations, rising legal exposure, growing uncertainty for banks, and an increasingly obvious fact about Asia's future: the region's trade, infrastructure, industrial growth, and technology demand were becoming more deeply tied to China, even as its financial backbone remained tethered to America. That mismatch could not last forever. At some point, every sophisticated financial center in Asia would have to calculate the cost of remaining fully inside the American coercive architecture against the cost of building a serious alternative relationship with Beijing. Singapore simply became the first major case where that calculation tipped decisively. The immediate trigger was not mysterious. It was cumulative sanctions pressure, reaching the point where the cost of compliance stopped looking like prudence and started looking like self-harm. This is one of the least understood dynamics in modern financial statecraft. Sanctions do not fail only when they are weak. They can also fail when they are overused. More specifically, they fail when the cost imposed on third-party intermediaries becomes greater than the cost of defecting into an alternative system. Once that threshold is crossed, sanctions stop reinforcing dependence and start incentivizing exit. That is what happened here. For years, Singapore's financial establishment had managed successive layers of American sanctions exposure through negotiation, carve-outs, legal restructuring, compliance redesign, and quiet diplomatic coordination. That was possible because the system still made sense. The benefits of remaining inside the American-centered order exceeded the burden of accommodating its constraints. But every additional round changes the equation. Every new compliance burden is not evaluated in isolation. It is added to accumulated compliance fatigue, accumulated operational complexity, accumulated foregone opportunity, and accumulated frustration from being forced to choose between regional commercial logic and extra-regional political risk. Once the balance tilts, the decision ceases to be ideological. It becomes mathematical. That is exactly why this matters so much. Because ideological systems can survive emotion, arithmetic systems usually cannot. If a bank can preserve more business, face lower switching costs, maintain regional client relationships, and reduce future vulnerability by routing a greater share of its activity through alternative clearing architecture, then at some point the move is no longer a geopolitical statement. It becomes fiduciary logic. And once that happens, American leverage begins to decay from the inside. This is the part the public almost never sees. Most people hear the phrase dollar hegemony and imagine something abstract: reserve currency status, treasury demand, or global confidence in US markets. All of that matters, but the day-to-day reality of dollar power is much more operational. It lives inside correspondent banking relationships, settlement rails, compliance standards, legal dispute frameworks, custody structures, payment visibility, and the practical fear of being cut off from the system that handles the world's most important transactions. The threat that made sanctions so effective was simple: lose access to dollar clearing, and your institution may cease to function at serious scale. That is a terrifying weapon. But it only works if the target believes there is no acceptable alternative. The moment an acceptable alternative begins to exist, the psychology changes. And psychological shifts in finance are rarely dramatic at first. They do not look like panic, they look like optionality. That is what Singapore's move created: precedent-backed optionality. It suggested that a sophisticated, globally respected, US-aligned financial hub could meaningfully deepen its integration with Chinese settlement, financing, and technology architecture without immediately suffering catastrophic capital flight, sovereign panic, or institutional collapse. That is a profound signal, because precedent is more contagious than pressure. Once one highly credible actor proves that recalibration is survivable, every other actor quietly begins running the same model. Tokyo runs it, Seoul runs it, Kuala Lumpur runs it, Jakarta runs it, private banks run it, commodity traders run it, port operators run it, tech investors run it. The question is no longer, would exit be unthinkable? The question becomes, at what point does partial exit become optimal? That is how spheres of influence erode, not all at once. At first, only at the margins. And then suddenly, because the margins were where the structure's assumptions were holding everything together. The historical parallel that comes closest is Suez, but in reverse. In 1956, Britain and France launched a military operation to retake control of the Suez Canal after Egypt nationalized it. Militarily, they performed well enough, but military success did not matter. The United States refused to underwrite British financial stability under market pressure, and that single decision revealed the truth more clearly than any battle could have done. Britain could no longer act strategically at global scale without American financial backing. Suez marked the public exposure of imperial dependence. The Singapore moment marks the quiet exposure of hegemonic overreach. At Suez, financial leverage proved stronger than military maneuver. In Singapore, the same logic has turned back on the power that once used it so effectively. That is the strategic irony. The United States spent decades perfecting financial coercion because it was cheaper, cleaner, and more politically sustainable than military escalation. And it worked. It worked so well, in fact, that Washington gradually forgot the central condition of all coercive instruments. If used too broadly, they create incentives for adaptation. People build around pressure. States build around pressure. Banks build around pressure. Entire regions build around pressure. And when they do, the instrument that once reinforced centrality begins to sponsor alternatives. That is exactly why China's role here is so important. Beijing did not invent this opportunity in March 2025. It spent decades preparing for it. This is where the analysis has to rise above the immediate event and look at the longer strategic arc. China's engagement with Singapore is not some sudden reaction to a single US policy move. It is the mature phase of a project that began generations ago. Chinese leaders understood early that if their country was ever to compete seriously with the United States, it would need not just factories and export power, but financial architecture, legal confidence, settlement credibility, and technological ecosystems capable of attracting sophisticated external partners. And for a long time, Singapore served as both model and bridge. It demonstrated how a small but trusted jurisdiction could turn neutrality, competence, legal clarity, and infrastructural excellence into systemic centrality. China studied that closely. It studied port management, industrial zoning, logistics integration, regulatory design, investment frameworks, dispute resolution, capital discipline, and the choreography by which confidence becomes compounding power. Now it is turning that study into strategic absorption. In the new phase, China is no longer merely learning from Singapore. It is positioning itself to become the larger architecture within which Singapore must operate. That is a major difference. And the March 2025 agreements symbolize that difference clearly. Their significance is not only their size, it is their direction. They do not merely represent commercial cooperation, they represent institutional nesting. Singapore's future growth in critical sectors becomes more deeply embedded inside Chinese-financed, Chinese-linked, Chinese-standardized systems. Once that embedding deepens, political alignment does not need to be declared explicitly. It becomes structurally implied. This matters especially in technology. A lot of observers still think of infrastructure in concrete terms. Ports, roads, rail, terminals, industrial parks. But in the 21st century, the most important infrastructure increasingly includes payment networks, cloud systems, chips, data governance, research ecosystems, advanced manufacturing clusters, and the financing vehicles that coordinate them. That is where the real race is. If capital, talent, regulatory trust, and regional demand increasingly converge inside Chinese-linked frameworks, then America does not just lose transactions, it loses tomorrow's default setting. That is the deeper issue. The fight is not only over who profits from today's trade, it is over who becomes the unavoidable organizing center of Asia's next generation of growth. And in that competition, Singapore matters immensely because it has always been a validator. If a system works in Singapore, other actors infer seriousness. If Singapore integrates a standard, investors treat it as mature. If Singapore blesses a settlement mechanism, businesses view it as credible. If Singapore shifts, the region pays attention. That is why this was not a local event. It was a regional signal with global implications. Now let us bring this back to the United States in concrete terms. What does America actually lose when a financial hub like Singapore begins redirecting major flows toward Beijing? The first loss is revenue. And while that is the most obvious, it is also the least important. Yes, American financial institutions benefit directly and indirectly from the centrality of dollar-based intermediation. Yes, the transaction flows, advisory services, legal structuring, reserve recycling, and investment opportunities matter. Yes, losing even a portion of that system has commercial consequences. But the second loss matters more: visibility. When transactions clear through dollar-linked channels, Washington and American-aligned institutions do not merely process money. They gain insight into networks, counterparties, exposure patterns, evasion behavior, and the movement of capital across politically sensitive geographies. Visibility is power. It aids sanctions enforcement. It helps track illicit finance. It strengthens intelligence. It provides early warning. It turns financial plumbing into strategic awareness. When those transactions migrate into alternative systems, the revenue loss is real, but the visibility loss is more consequential. A transaction that no longer passes through your rails is not just a transaction you did not earn from. It is a transaction you can no longer see clearly, and great powers do not like blindness. The third loss is subtler still: psychological centrality. The dollar system depends not only on trust in American institutions, but on the belief that for any serious player in global finance, participation remains more rational than defection. Once credible actors begin demonstrating that selective defection is survivable, that belief weakens. This does not mean the dollar collapses. It does not mean an overnight end to American financial primacy. That kind of sensationalism misses the real story. The real story is slower and more dangerous: the gradual reduction of automaticity. It becomes less automatic that Asian growth must route through American-approved channels. Less automatic that sanctions threats will compel obedience. Less automatic that technology ecosystems will default toward US-aligned standards. Less automatic that regional elites will see Washington as the unquestioned financial center of gravity. And once automaticity is gone, power becomes more expensive to maintain. That is the phrase to hold on to: more expensive to maintain. That is how hegemony usually declines, not because it vanishes suddenly, but because the effort required to reproduce it increases while the returns become less certain. The United States can still defend the dollar system. It still possesses extraordinary strengths: the deepest capital markets in the world, unmatched legal protections for investors, reserve currency legitimacy, military reach, alliance networks, innovation depth, and the immense inertia of existing global financial habits. But those strengths are not a license for strategic complacency. If Washington treats every alignment as permanent, every hub as captive, every partner as infinitely compliance tolerant, and every alternative system as immature until the day it becomes functional at scale, then it will keep discovering losses only after they have already been converted into precedent. That is what Singapore represents: not the end, a warning, a demonstration, a proof of concept, and perhaps most importantly, a tutorial for others. Because Singapore is not an isolated case. It is the canary in the ventilation shaft of Asian finance. Hong Kong is already constrained by a different political logic, but still relevant as a financial laboratory. Kuala Lumpur has long been experimenting with greater use of non-dollar settlement. Gulf states are rethinking currency exposure. Regional development banks are diversifying options. Commodity flows are being repriced through more plural architectures. Central banks are studying swap lines, digital settlement models, and backup mechanisms, not because they intend immediate rupture, but because they have learned the obvious lesson of the last decade. Dependency is safe until it becomes weaponized too often. That lesson is now universal. And once a lesson becomes universal, strategy has to adapt. There is also a deeper philosophical point here, one that goes beyond banks and policy. Americans often experience the benefits of hegemony without seeing them directly. They show up as lower borrowing costs, stronger external demand for treasuries, deeper capital market resilience, greater sanctions effectiveness, higher tolerance for deficits, and a world in which U.S. institutions enjoy structural preference. Most citizens do not wake up each morning and think about Singapore's role in Southeast Asian dollar clearing, but they live downstream from it. They live downstream from a world where other people need the architecture America sits inside. That need subsidizes power. It subsidizes policy flexibility. It subsidizes economic resilience. It even, indirectly, subsidizes the ability to make mistakes and still recover faster than others. So when a place like Singapore begins to demonstrate that dependence can be renegotiated, Americans should pay attention, not because disaster arrives tomorrow, but because the cumulative erosion of invisible subsidies eventually becomes visible at home. It appears in funding costs, in weaker coercive reach, in reduced policy room, in more contested markets, in harder alliance management. In a world where the United States still matters enormously, but can no longer assume that everyone's most rational move is to remain tightly nested inside its preferred systems. That is the world being built now. And the final layer of this story may be the most important of all. The struggle here is not really between two press offices, two tariff policies, or even two governments in the narrow sense. It is between two time horizons. Washington, too often, manages the news cycle. Beijing, whatever its many weaknesses and contradictions, manages the long cycle. That does not mean China always wins. It does mean China often plans in ways American politics struggles to sustain. This is one reason apparently technical agreements matter so much more than public rhetoric. Rhetoric satisfies the present. Architecture governs the future. A Friday press release can matter more than a primetime speech if it changes who settles the next 20 years of regional commerce. A bilateral financing framework can matter more than a summit communique if it changes where technology clusters, who arbitrates standards, and which currency becomes routine in the daily operation of growth. That is why the Singapore episode deserves to be understood not as a side note, but as a chapter in a larger historical shift. We are moving from a world of uncontested financial hierarchy into one of contested financial architecture. Not a simple replacement, not a clean handoff, not the sudden collapse of one system and the seamless rise of another. Something messier, something more regionalized, something in which the United States remains indispensable, but no longer unchallengeable in the operational spaces that once seemed safely anchored. Something in which China does not need to overthrow the dollar everywhere. It only needs to make it progressively less unavoidable in the places that matter most to Asia's future. That is a far more realistic ambition, and far more dangerous for Washington precisely because it does not look dramatic enough to trigger immediate overreaction. So let us say clearly what happened in those 48 hours. What changed was not just money. What changed was precedent. What changed was the psychological cost of recalibration. What changed was the perceived manageability of partial exit from an American-centered financial orbit. What changed was the demonstration effect available to every other aligned hub now facing the same arithmetic. And what changed, perhaps most importantly, was the balance between two strategic stories. For decades, the American story was simple. Participation in our system is more rewarding than any alternative, and departure is too costly to contemplate. Singapore has not destroyed that story, but it has punctured its universality. And once universality is gone, competition begins in earnest. That is the real significance of March 14th and 15th, 2025. No headlines captured it properly. No tanks rolled. No panic bell rang on television. The world did not stop. Markets did not scream. But something quiet and structural shifted. A trusted US-aligned financial node showed that when cumulative pressure becomes excessive, strategic realignment can proceed not through revolt, but through orderly administrative adaptation. That is how systems begin to loosen, not always through rebellion, sometimes through optimization. And that may be even more difficult to stop, because you can punish defiance. It is harder to punish arithmetic. You can denounce disloyalty. It is harder to denounce cost-benefit calculation. You can threaten smaller states for making geopolitical choices. It is harder when those choices can be explained as prudent balance sheet management by globally respected institutions doing exactly what capitalism trained them to do. That is the trap Washington now faces. It built a coercive instrument so effective that it began to assume more use meant more control. In reality, more use eventually meant more incentive to build around it. Singapore did not create that logic. It exposed it. And Beijing, more than anyone else, was prepared to receive the result. So if you want to understand the future of American power, do not look only at aircraft carriers, election speeches, or sanctions announcements. Look at settlement systems. Look at infrastructure finance. Look at data governance protocols. Look at technology co-development vehicles. Look at which currency becomes routine rather than symbolic. Look at which cities quietly stop asking permission from the old center and start negotiating confidence with the new one. That is where the map is changing. And that is why these 48 hours matter so much. Because what happened in Singapore was not only a transaction, it was a message. A message to every bank, every sovereign wealth manager, every port operator, every compliance department, every finance minister, every regional development planner, and every strategist trying to understand where Asia is heading. The message was simple. Exit is not free. But it may no longer be unthinkable. And once that idea enters the bloodstream of the international financial system, the structure of power begins to change from within, quietly, incrementally, then all at once. The White House in those days was managing a news cycle. Singapore was managing a strategic recalibration. Beijing was managing a century. And in the competition between governments that react to events and governments that build architectures for them, the winner is rarely decided by who speaks louder. It is decided by who becomes harder to route around. For most of the modern era, that was the United States. The deeper question after Singapore is whether that is still as true in Asia as Washington assumes. If the answer is becoming less certain, then the real loss is not one deal, one hub, or one weekend. The real loss is the beginning of a world in which American financial primacy is no longer the default operating system of the fastest growing region on Earth. And if that is what these 48 hours really signaled, then history may one day remember them not as the moment America noticed a strategic shift, but as the moment it failed to.